So welcome for this evening. My name's Guy Howard. I am very lucky and very honoured to be the director of the Cabot Institute for the Environment. And we really hope that during this evening we can really inspire you and get you thinking about what does it mean to have a just transition, both in Bristol and more widely. So the Cabot Institute is launching our new 3-year strategy today. You can find that already on our website. And to support that, we've updated some of the communications, and we've developed a new set of videos that really try and set out what we do. And I want to just show you one of them before we move on to the lecture, because I think this really shows what we are about as an institute. Diverse, committed, and passionate. And I very much hope you feel the same way.
To protect our future
on a changing planet,
we recognize the need
to limit our impact,
identify better ways to live,
and take action together.
we combine expertise
across and beyond
our university
to empower
and co-create
new knowledge,
and solutions
to environmental challenges.
We nurture talent
Across disciplines
and career stages.
to create the future leaders.
for our changing planet.
United we can imagine.
innovate,
and create.
a better future for our world.
So I would like to move now to the main business of the evening. So I'm really pleased to welcome Chris Stark as our keynote speaker this evening. So as many of you hopefully know, Chris is the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. For those of you who don't know, the CCC, as it is very often known as, is the independent body that advises both the UK and the devolved governments on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reports to Parliament on the progress being made against emissions targets and in preparing for and adapting to climate change. Chris led the CCC's work to recommend a net zero target for the UK, and he speaks regularly on the transition to a net zero carbon economy and the need to confront climate change with urgency. And for those of you who, like me, have heard Chris speak in the media, on radio, on television, you'll know that he is very robust, as is his committee, at holding governments to account on the actions that they have committed to on climate change and pointing out where more needs to be done. And I think that's, as an ex-civil servant myself, I applaud that robustness. Before joining the CCC, Chris was the Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government, and prior to that held various positions in Whitehall, including working on economic policy. So, the topic of Chris's speech tonight is just transitions. Now, it's something both the Cabot Institute and Bristol as a city recognise as being one of the most defining challenges of our time, and we all look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. So please, put your hands together and welcome Chris onto the stage.
Thank you very much, Guy, and thank you very much to all of you for coming out tonight to see me and others speak. It's a great privilege to do that. What a room. So entirely comfortable setting for me to stand before you and talk to you. I mean, I should say a bit about me before I get into this. Guy's given me a very generous introduction, but I am a geek. So I am Chief Climate Geek in the CCC. And it's a great job to have. And what I want to say before I begin my talk is just something about this institution that I lead at the moment, the Climate Change Committee. So we are the product of a piece of legislation that was set back in 2008, and that's the Climate Change Act. And it's worth remembering just what was happening around that time. It was a very different era in British politics. So the legislation that led to our creation was the product of, and I'm very deliberately raising this with you now, a period of remarkable consensus on climate change. And actually the bill that became the Act had its origins in the opposition benches. It was actually a Tory bill initially. And I make that point to you today because we're not in that time now, I fear. And the Act that led to our creation envisaged periods like this. This is not the first period that we've been in where we've seen rising concern about what to do about climate change, rising concern about the actions that we need to take as a country. And I wanted to say to you, before I begin this, I am going to talk about some of the things that have happened recently in British politics. Tomorrow we'll publish some analysis of what the Prime Minister said and some of the other announcements over the summer. But I'm not frightened of the moment that we're in, because we have a very robust piece of legislation in the Climate Change Act that is there to guide the country towards the goals that we have for reducing emissions, for also adapting to climate change. We are part of that. We're here to give independent advice to that. We are not part of government, very deliberately, and that Act is a very good piece of legislation because it puts a responsibility on governments over time to act on this. And we're seeing, I think, a moment to test that. And I welcome it. One of the things I really welcome that the Prime Minister said just a few weeks ago was that he would like to see greater scrutiny of the targets that we have for climate change in this country. I think we should have that too. So we're in one of those moments now where I think it is important to reflect on what we're trying to do as a country and do the right thing. But we also do need our political system to respond to that. So we'll see if that does if we see our politicians respond in the right way. I'm going to start with the brass tacks. So where are we on this global issue of climate change? By far, I think the most impactful chart that I ever show when I do a presentation is this one. So this is the data that we have, actual data of the composition of the world's atmosphere over nearly 1 million years. So we get this, initially at least, from the bubbles trapped in ice at the poles. And you can see over that 800,000 years that I'm showing you here, that natural carbon cycle. And then that bit at the end is what we've done globally since we discovered fossil fuels. It's not the edge of the chart, it's actual data. And you can probably see how rapidly that's changing. And the only bit of science that I will talk about today at all, actually, is that we know there's a near linear relationship between the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature on the planet. So we should worry about this chart. It's not the first time we've been at these concentration levels as a planet. 2 or 3 million years ago, possibly 4 million years ago, we were at similar levels. But the seas were probably 20 meters higher than they are today in that period. So this is a troubling thing for me. And I think it's worth saying there is a lot of discussion about what we know or don't know about the future for this planet. What I can say is that now for almost 50 years, we've been doing very, very, very accurate temperature forecasts based on basically that chart that I showed you earlier, the amount of CO2 that is dissolved in the world's atmosphere. What I'm showing you here is a range of forecasts that were done from 1970 onwards, and the actual temperature that we saw, the observed temperature. And what you see, with the exception of one of those studies there, is that almost all of them got it right. So what we see now is this. This is entirely expected. This is the actual temperature on the planet measured. We've probably warmed the planet by around 1.2 degrees centigrade since we started using fossil fuels in earnest globally. Something this country has a lot to say for when it comes to that story. So that leads me then to show you this chart, which is the final chart I'll show you on the global story, just rattling through the position globally on climate change. We know how much carbon dioxide and other fossil fuels and other greenhouse gases are dissolved in the world's atmosphere. We know we can accurately predict future temperature outcomes. We can also accurately predict future climate outcomes based on that temperature data. And that means we can bring this together, which is basically showing you where the world is heading in terms of temperature outcomes based on the emissions globally that we are seeing. So what you see on the left of this chart is the wrong story. We're seeing emissions grow. We have a set of choices before us globally that lead to those little boxes at the end there, the temperature outcomes at the end of it. These are the median pathways. There is certainly some error around it. But broadly, the message here is we've got to cut greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as we can. And what I'm showing you here is where we stood after the last of the global climate summits, COP27 in Egypt. In 2 months, we'll be in the United Arab Emirates having the same discussion about COP28, and we'll still be looking at a chart that looks largely like this. There's a few things to say about this. The Paris Agreement is what steers the global effort on climate. And the Paris Agreement was signed just a few years ago. When that treaty was made, we were facing temperature outcomes probably a degree centigrade higher than the purple line that you see on that chart. So we are making progress globally. That is partly about what governments are doing, but it's also, I would say, mainly what's happening in the economy itself with clean technologies. There is a thing happening now which is very exciting. What you see here, at that top line, is the existing policies that have been pledged that we can round up globally, where that would take you, so 2.7 degrees centigrade median outcome. If you think the pledges that were made at the COP, what are called the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, if you think they'll be delivered, that takes you to 2.4 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. And if you believe, and there is a big if, that the net zero targets and the NDCs will also be delivered, that takes you to under 2 degrees centigrade of warming post-industry. And you might know that the Paris Agreement talks about that as being the goal. The 1.5 degree line, which is the thing that we talked a lot about in Glasgow, is the green one. And you can see how hard that is to achieve. I am positive about the future because of the developments that we're seeing in the energy sector particularly. I think under 2 is in play. 1.5 looks very, very difficult. In fact, 1.5 really exists only in a model at the moment. So we'll see, won't we? But this is the key thing. Where is the UK on that? Well, we did some work, Guy mentioned it, that we did some work to recommend a few years ago that the UK should have a net zero target. And all of the work we've done since is based around achieving that target. And it's as much about the path as it is about the target itself. This is the UK story on that same chart. It's a different story from the global one. Our emissions produced here, our territorial emissions have been coming down to the point where they're about half what they were in 1990 today. That's a very positive story. We would say you could have done much more than that, but that is more than you would see in other G7 economies, for example. The red line is our recommendation for the path ahead for the country. It is also the government's path, so they have broadly accepted that path. Those blocks you see on the chart there are the legal targets that are in that Climate Change Act that I talked about earlier. And we're about to set and train the process of setting the next of these carbon budgets, which is our job every 5 years. You can probably see how hard it is to get to that 6th carbon budget. And you can probably see that carbon budgets 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 were set in a different era. So they were aiming at a different 2050 goal when those carbon budgets were set, an 80% reduction by 2050. Carbon budget 6 is the one that matters, and what we're doing in the 2030s is what matters. And getting to that kind of outcome involves a whole set of system changes across the economy, which we need to see happen quickly. The other thing I'll draw out of this chart is the shape of that red line is a sort of inverted S. I don't know if you can see that, but the initial part of that is a slight plateau. And that's because we need to gear up all the effort in sectors of the economy where we haven't been doing enough. And that takes time. There's natural inertia to that. So we can't just switch on decarbonisation policies tomorrow. That's what's in that red line. And I won't take you through all the colours on this chart, but this is a good way of just expressing what needs to be done to hit that kind of outcome over time. The red line again, dotted red line there is the path. What's within it is a set of sectoral stories playing out. Now I wanted to show you this chart because we make this chart. We do this every 5 years. We spend a lot of time thinking about it, but actually what we're mostly thinking about now is practical things. So if you want to cut emissions in industry, in transport, in the built environment, in farming, it's actually not now about inventing new things. It's about getting things done. It's about getting spades in the ground, to use the Prime Minister's term. And that takes time. We need to build up supply chains to do this stuff. We've got to have skilled people that are able to deploy these solutions. That's what holds us up at the moment, as well as the policy discussion and, of course, the money discussion. So if we want to go faster on this, I'm up for that, but that's what we've got to think about. With all that in mind then, coming on now to the question of where we stand and the just transition, where are we? The Prime Minister said a few weeks ago in Downing Street that he was sure we would hit our targets. I'm less sure, I'll be honest. And we'll put some numbers out tomorrow that give some justification for that. But back to that chart, the target that really matters for me is not the one the Prime Minister talked about. So he talked a lot about the net zero target, and net zero is important because it's the anchor. What matters more is the area under the curve. So the interim targets and the near-term targets, to me, are more important. Happily, the Prime Minister reaffirmed his commitment the UK's commitment to its 2030 pledge, that NDC I talked about, which is to reduce emissions by 68% by 2030. That's where we would need to be to hit that target. So let's just ask ourselves a question, where are we on that? And the latest data we have is from 2022. So go with me on this journey. We can stand in 2022, 8 years from the 2030 target, and we can look at the progress we made 8 years prior to 2022 and the progress that we need to make over the next 8 years to hit the 2030 target. That's what I'm showing you here. This is the annual rate of emissions change that we're seeing in yellow in the previous 8 years, and then what needs to be achieved in the next 8 years across those same sectors I showed you in the rainbow chart. The one sector we've done well in so far is the power sector. So we've been cutting emissions in power pretty effectively. That's the only sector where the pace of emissions reduction is less in the future than it is in the past. In every other sector, we've got to very, very significantly scale up ambition. And you can ask us a very simple question, do we have the kind of policies in place, the kind of response from the private sector and the consumer response that would deliver those kind of increases in the pace of ambition, the pace of change? I don't think we do. And we can look at that in a different way. So we're still in the recovery period after the pandemic. If we take out aviation and shipping from that story, again, look back 8 years, look forward 8 years, the pace of emissions reduction 8 years prior has been about 3% per year. That needs to double in pace over the next 8 years. And if you take out the power sector, where there is lots of policy and lots of interest and lots of stuff happening, I think a more realistic position starts to emerge. We've only been cutting emissions by about 1% per year outside of the power sector. That's got to quadruple over the next 8 years. 8 years. We're in the first of those years. Ask yourself the question, do we have the kind of policy in place that would deliver that? I hope the Prime Minister's right on that. I hope that we do. And that's just another way of looking at it to finish off that sectoral story. This is, again, those sectors that we make an appraisal of the progress in each of those sectors. The dot at the line is what we would expect if we weren't trying with policy to reduce emissions. The dot at the bottom in that sector is what we've got to hit if we want to be on target for the 2030 target for the UK. The stripes in between are our appraisal of the risk of the policy programme that we see in each of those sectors. The more red, the worse this assessment is. We'll update this tomorrow, so you'll see this tomorrow. You're going to see more red, sadly, in most sectors. And that's because we're indulging in quite a risky strategy, I think, to cut emissions across the economy right now, and crossing our fingers and hoping that the things will happen. You can see some of this stuff is very worrying, and although you won't see it by 2030, one of my biggest worries is things like the natural world, the story of agriculture and the land use. Although the emissions reduction in 2030 is not enormous, but in the future that's a very important sector. We're just not seeing policy put into place in those areas. Buildings, very important for cities, of course, similar concern. So now we come to the question of the just transition. So if we're going to be successful in achieving the changes that I've talked about, what would we need to see? And this in the last 5 minutes is going to be my kind of main point, I suppose, to set us up for the discussion on the just transition. Let me start with an admission to you all. I hate the term just transition. And the reason I hate it is not because I personally hate it, it's because I know that others hate it. And it's a very value-laden term in my view at least. It's very subjective. And I think crucially it doesn't chime with the values that some of the people who live in this country have. And that worries me because if we've got a large swathe of the society who wouldn't see justness in this transition at all or even recognize that term, then I think we're turning people off. I prefer fairness as a way of thinking about it, and I'll mix those terms together, but I think that is absolutely key. We do need to think about how fair the transition is in all sorts of ways. Tonight I'm going to explore just 2 dimensions of that, mainly because I've got lots of pretty charts to show you. But those two aspects are the costs of this net zero transition by sector. And then much more interesting, something you may not have seen before from me, it's on the workforce changes, the employment shifts that come with this, really important. So let's just start with that question of cost. So one of the happy jobs that I have is every 5 years bringing together with my team this view of what needs to happen to hit net zero. And it's mainly a story of investing as a country to hit net zero. So it's about capital investment, to use a term that the economists like, but basically buying kit. So it's replacing stuff that presently today uses fossil fuels with something that uses clean energy. That is the main task. There's also a bit to do in the natural world, of course, as well. But it is an investment challenge, and we need to do, as a country, more investment if we want to hit net zero. That's not necessarily a bad thing, even if you don't care about climate. This is an expression of how much extra investment the country would need to do if we were to hit net zero. And it's mainly about those things that you see on the right of that chart. It's things like energy networks. It's things like the transport system. We are investing more than we would if we were not trying to hit net zero. And that is often expressed by the naysayers as this extra cost to the country. So what you can do with this, you can see that each year this is of the order of 50, 60 billion pounds of extra capital investment that the country is making. This is pre-inflation as well, of course. We did this work back in 2020. You can roll those numbers up over the years to 2050. You can get a very big number indeed, north of £1 trillion of extra investment. But it's not a cost. Very important to make this point. It's buying you better climate outcomes, of course, but it's also buying you something very, very fundamental, which is a saving from using these capital assets, these new bits of kit. Now, this is 2020 analysis. We're updating it right now, actually, but you will see on this that there is a saving in the same sectors. This is if you buy an electric car, you're not having to spend money on petrol or diesel. The car itself is much more efficient. It's using electricity that comes often from a wind farm, which is itself getting cheaper and cheaper over time. That is a saving to the person driving that car. And you see that playing out, this invest to save story throughout the economy. The really happy news here is when you roll that up with the investment cost, you get to something that's approaching zero. So you don't need to care about climate change to think this is a good idea. And of course, you should care about climate change because it is a good idea on that basis as well. But the key thing is that analysis was done when fossil fuels were very cheap a few years ago. We're now in a world where fossil fuels are not cheap. They're very, very expensive. And of course, the relative saving of moving off those fossil fuels is now even greater. Now, we'll be able to put some numbers on that, but I'm happy to say in front of you today that I think it would now be a net saving to the economy if we hit net zero. So that is a very important thing to say. And of course, as technologies mature, they get cheaper. And of course, these cleaner technologies is where all the innovation is. And of course, that story is very, very compelling now of that ongoing progress that comes with that. That's a great story at the aggregate level across the whole economy, but no one is experiencing that level of saving overall. The other thing I'll note there is that you'll see those savings don't happen immediately. So we do have a challenge as a country to get to those kind of levels of investment and also to keep sticking with it because the savings come later, the payback. Now, we've done the work to look at that sectoral story and to ask the similar question, really, where do you see those savings and costs? When do you see them? What you see is those sectors I mentioned earlier. The first bar is the net saving. That's the capital investment minus the saving in 2035. And the next bar is where we are in 2050. And this tells a very important story about net zero. In some sectors, there's an enormous saving to the country, but in other sectors there are not. And the crucial sector, for me at least, is the buildings sector. You will see that there are costs in 2035 and there are more costs in 2050. And that's because as a country we have a terrible building stock and we need to invest in it. And we're heating it with, at the moment, fossil fuels. The technologies that we'll replace that with, like heat pumps, have an upfront cost. So this is a challenge. I'd say it's a fiscal challenge. We can spread the benefits to pay for the costs, and this thing will work out nicely. But that is the policy challenge before government. That's my first dimension on the just transition. There's no barrier to us doing it in a fair way, but we've got to be bold in using policy to achieve that kind of outcome. Let's move on to the next story, which is the story on jobs. And this is relatively new analysis for us. We are in the midst of, again, doing more work on it. So much rubbish talked about green jobs. And I would say also that the idea of a green job in itself being a positive thing is worth challenging. I've got a great story of one of the energy companies who did a little experiment of running a job advert, describing the same job as a green job, and the other job, the same job essentially as an engineering job. And they had 3 times as many applicants for the non-green job. despite it being the actual same job. So those of the working climate need to constantly check in on whether green is a good thing or not in the public perception. This is how we've framed it up in the work that we've done. New framing, we're looking at sectors now that will grow, transition, and adjust. And within that, where growth is conditional on something, policy mainly, where there's a genuine transition of some kind happening, so redirecting activity in that sector or straightforward phasing down of activity. That gives us choices, of course, about what we need to do with the workforce in those sectors. And where there are more sort of peripheral effects happening, some of those sectors are very much kind of enabling roles. Where do you think we'll be on this? Kind of interesting. 60% of jobs on that framing are not impacted by net zero at all. In fact, most of the economy is not impacted by net zero at all. And that's the key thing. And actually the areas where we need to phase down activity, very, very few of them. So this is something we can manage. And crucially, we need to think about this, I think, when we're making policy. This is another way of looking at those same workforce issues. We're looking at job numbers here in those same sectors and the potential for there to be more. And that's the story overall. The net story is of massive increase in employment at a net level across the economy, particularly in the built environment. That's all the skilled workers who are coming to do energy efficiency improvements in heat pumps. But there are sectors that will phase down, and we need to acknowledge that. But you will see that that is not the story overall, and that is the story that you often read about in the press. We can look at that on a geographical level as well, and what's interesting about this is you see that there's a sort of story playing out, depending what the challenge is in jobs, that isn't consistent. And one of the things I think we have to acknowledge is that for those fossil-fueled industries, you do get very specific, locational, geographically specific industries. You can see probably on the left there, concentrated impacts in the northeast of Scotland, where I'm from. That's the oil and gas sector and the phasing down. What we find generally is that where there is a story of job increases, they're generally dispersed across the whole economy. So it's a hugely positive thing for us to focus on net zero. You can probably see that on the right, jobs in building construction. And therefore, this is again something that we shouldn't worry about. Just coming to the end now. The other issue here is the pace of the transition, and it's not consistent. So there are some sectors where we need to ramp up very, very quickly to hit the goals for transport, for example. I'm showing you on the left here what needs to happen in electric vehicles. Interestingly, where we see that phase down activity I was talking about, it tends to be quite gradual, which tells you a story that we can manage it. And the other story I'll say is, this is a very good example of that. There will be massive new jobs in electric vehicle production, but if you don't grab them early, they'll be somewhere else. Very, very important. So, final thing, and I'll make the slides available afterwards because this is a useful tool. This just gives you a sense of the way we might bring together sort of various aspects of that jobs transition. I think the main thing I want to say to you, and I'll end on this, is that nothing that I've said to you tonight or any of the work that we've done tells me that we can't achieve net zero, or, crucially, that we can't manage to do this in a way that will benefit the workforce. And that, I think, is very contingent, ultimately, on the policy questions that sit underneath this. And my very final point to you is, I suppose, to say what's interesting to me as someone who does this as chief geek is there is nothing now that I think we couldn't achieve when it comes to net zero. We've kind of explored most of the things that you would need to do as an economy to hit it. What's interesting to me is that we need to think more, I think, about how we achieve those things rather than what they are. So when someone says to you, we don't know how to get to net zero, that's not true. But the path to it and the way in which we implement those things, that is not explored. That's the art of policy, and we do need policy. And I think, for me, coming back to the issue of the just transition, there's lots of aspects to that we didn't cover tonight. I didn't cover the income distribution impacts. I didn't cover the fact that climate change itself is a problem because the poorest of society experience those issues most. This will not work if we don't put fairness at the heart of policymaking from the start. And that, coming back to the Prime Minister, is something that I would like him to understand too, because when he says he can't put the burden on those who can least afford it, I agree with him, but that is a policy choice, and he has not made that choice. So we'll be putting that kind of pressure on the government as we head into, of course, the next general election. But this issue of the just transition, the fairness of that transition, is now the issue. And with that, I'll say thanks very much.
Thank you for that wonderful and informative talk, Chris. I'm Dr. Alix Dietzel, and I'll be acting as the chair of the panel discussion. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a senior lecturer in politics, and I focus on just transition and climate justice. And I'm also the associate director for impact and innovation at the Cabot Institute. Tonight, it's my honor to be joined by a very interesting and exciting panel. I won't introduce Chris because you've just met him. But first we have Jaya Chakrabarti, who is the outgoing, she wanted me to emphasize that, outgoing president of the Bristol Chamber of Commerce and West of England Initiative. She has spent her life championing causes through data analysis, focusing on corporate responsibility, modern slavery, and more recently, afforestation. And I should also say she got an honorary doctorate from the University of Bristol just this summer.
Doctor, not a doctor.
Doctor, not a doctor. I asked whether she wanted me to use doctor, and she said no. Then we have Bevan, who is the co-lead and the co-creator of the Black Seeds Network, which showcases and supports the work of environmentalists of color and Black environmentalists in and around Bristol. And she also works as a consultant advisor on a range of environmental and social justice projects around the city of Bristol. And finally, we have Ed Atkins, Dr. Ed Atkins, who is senior lecturer in the School of Geography on the human side. Ed's research explores the topic of just transition, and he has recently published a new book, which is all about just energy transition. And here he explores energy transitions in the UK and asserts a new energy model that has greater community control and an approach of energy justice at its core. So a very diverse panel that we have tonight with lots of areas of expertise. How we're going to manage the next 45 minutes is that we have some pre-submitted questions that people submitted online, which I will be asking the panel. But we'd also like to ask you in the audience tonight if there's anything that you would like to raise as a question. I have a couple of stipulations, and we'll be strict about them. The first is that I will not allow, it's more of a comment than a question. And if I see you launching into a comment than a question speech, I will interrupt you. So please don't make me do that. And please stick to questions. Please try to be respectful and kind. And please try to keep your questions as brief as possible. I'll also be keeping an eye on the dynamics in the room, because what I would like to avoid is a certain demographic asking all of the questions. So if I don't call on you, it's for that reason, and I'm just trying to ensure that we have a mix of voices in the room. I'll begin by asking a pre-submitted question, which I'm going to ask of each panelist as a kind of introduction to your views on just transition. So, someone asked, specifically in Bristol, what issues of transitioning justly should be prioritized? And as a normal member of society, whatever that person meant by that, how do we contribute towards this transition happening? And I'd like to start with Ed for that question, please.
Thanks, Alex. I hope you can all hear me, particularly at the back. I think it's a great question. It's something which is really grounded in the local city and that sense of place that we have with where we live. I want to celebrate something which has happened and continues to happen, and I want to see happen again and again and again in the city. I saw the Bristol Green Capital Partnership team walk in. I don't know where you are. Hello. Hello. But they have led a series of community change action plans, which foreground our kind of climate policy, what we want to see in our climate policy in Bristol, with community voices, community organisations, and those aren't just based in neighbourhoods, they're based in particular demographic groups, people who face particular challenges in climate change and climate breakdown. And the visions that have come out from that are inclusive, they are diverse, and they are important voices that we don't necessarily hear. If you want to participate in that, participate in your community. Climate action, climate policy emanates from where we live. Our voices are better when they are stronger together, and I would think that the climate change action plans demonstrate that. They have led to a declaration, a just transition declaration in the city, which is something we should all celebrate and has been celebrated nationally. So participate. Thank you.
And Nisha, may I turn to you next?
Oh, yeah, okay. So thank you. and I hope you can hear me as well. I guess the thing that I would really like to prioritise is the work around equalities, justice, fairness. There are lots of different terms on how we can think about that. We can go to equity, we could take it even further than that. And actually, it's not enough to get everybody in a room together. We have to address the power dynamics that happen in those spaces. Quite often I'm invited so that someone can hear my voice, and I actually really do not like that term or that way of expressing things anymore. And I get so frustrated, I now say, please, I'm not here to sing you a song, I'm not an echo, I'm here to work with you, as an equal partner on an equal footing. Can you please replace the term voice with what you really mean? So do you want my contribution? Do you want my opinion? Do you want my skills, my expertise? So those are the conversations that I'd really like to see prioritised, and framing things a bit differently so it reaches more people, a wider group of people. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Jaya.
Wow, so all of the above, they've all said it. But I guess I probably reiterate that there's no environmental or climate justice without social justice. We have a housing crisis. We have less than one candidate for every job going right now across the country. We have skill shortages. We have so many things. And then there are people who are going to work and still can't afford the basics. So from the business perspective, from anyone who employs someone, they should be looking at strengthening their workforce so that they can afford to make sustainable decisions. That means real living wage. That means understanding whether or not they can actually afford to travel to work towards the end of the month. There are some very real issues that we have, and I think Bristol is in a prime position to do something about this, given the energy that's happening and a lot of the political will starting to align. So I would start with that.
Thank you. And Chris, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I might say something that might surprise you, I think. So I love coming to Bristol because obviously lots of good things happening here when it comes to climate. Well, at least lots of people talking about climate in a very positive, progressive way, but you don't find that in every part of the country. No. And I kind of feel that's okay. What I kind of wanted to say actually is that we should care about climate change, but also be tolerant of the fact that not everyone will care as much as us. And we still need to see progress on those issues in that environment. And it goes back to what I said at the start of my talk, I think. But maybe we need to get a bit more comfortable about tackling climate change, hitting net zero, without making that the sole focus. I mean, I think that's probably where we are now in this sort of next phase of this net zero transition, is that not everyone cares about net zero in the way that I do, or at least I'm required to. That's okay. As long as we're doing the things that matter, my own view is that the motivation for those things is way beyond just the climate outcomes. So jobs is a thing we've talked about. Investment in communities is another thing we've talked about. Just straightforward people being warm in their homes is a very useful way of framing this up. And for those of us that don't care in the same way about some of those social issues, and that's, a large part of the society would identify with that. It's okay to talk about energy security and the fact that as a country we are achieving a greater degree of energy independence here. And it happens to be that net zero delivers a lot of that. So I think we need to get better at talking generally about the many different benefits that come from this transition, and not just making it solely about the transition itself. And now people like me do need to care about it. But that's how we'll see success. And I don't think we need to ram this stuff down people's throats to get that to happen.
Great. Okay, thank you all. I think let's open it to the audience and see if anyone would like to ask a question. No pressure, because I have some more that have been submitted. I see a hand over here, Tuan.
My question stems from a comment that Chris made towards the end of his presentation. You mentioned that there's going to be a boom in new industries. I think you specifically mentioned electric vehicles. And my question is, as climate change is a global issue, how do well-developed Western countries with strong financial capital, a well-educated workforce, and the means to provide initial funding for these new infrastructure projects, not strong-arm, say, for example, less developed nations in Africa or Southeast Asia, where these could be good ways of building up their own population's workforce? How do we ensure a just transition, not just in the Western world, but across the globe without
Thank you.
damaging our economy.
I also saw a second hand in this area, so let's take 2 questions at once. This person here at the front.
The trade union movement has been working on just transition for the last 15 years. They published a leaflet in about 2008 about a just transition. I think it was called something like a just transition to a green future. And I just wanted to know to what extent the Climate Change Committee is working closely with the trade union movement.
Yeah, very happy to cover that. I mean, I'll cover that one first if I can. I mean, there's a link to the first question as well. So we do have contact with the trade unions, and indeed they've fed into analysis that we've done in the past. But I think the trade unions, or the trades unions, are only one part of that story. So a lot of the work I showed you there, actually, there's a longer version of that, believe it or not, which would cover off transitions in the past that have been handled badly, and chief among them the coal transition. And the experience of many of the trades unions is that we don't want to see that happen again. I think the happy story on that is that it won't happen again, partly because it's not nearly as disruptive, and mainly because this is a very unusual transition, just or not, because we know what it looks like. So, you know, there's a sort of, to me, that's the real kind of benefit of it, is that we should be able to use the fact that we're trying to do this thing and that we know broadly what needs to be achieved to our benefit, to avoid the kind of negative impacts that we've seen in communities from the movement off coal. And I live in the west of Scotland, I see a lot of that. You know, the kind of post-industrial story is literally generations of damage that has been done by that. So some of that stuff is in the things that I talked about there, but actually you don't need to have that outlook on it to want to see that come. I think what's interesting about the transition, to make a more general point, is that really what I was talking about is a transition like many others. We've had them before. It's just that we're against the clock on this one. We've never been in that. We've never been in that position before. And I think, again, that should work to our advantage if we use it properly. So we've got to do certain things by certain dates. Otherwise, we don't hit those kind of targets. Now, we may miss those targets, but we still inevitably will have to do the things that are, you know, within those pathways I talked about. And for me, that's what's exciting about it, is that we can do a bit more of extra planning around that. The kind of method and policy that gets you there is certainly up for debate, but the outcome isn't. And I think these workforce impacts are so central to that. We can, you know, I've showed you some of the numbers. We have other numbers. The kind of transitions that go with this are really rapid, and they are the future of the economy, whether you care about climate change or not. Joe Biden's been talking that way about it. So I sort of feel we should be able to articulate this better in a way that brings people together to talk about it, whether it's a just transition or not. I think it's just a transition, and avoid that damage that was done. And to address the first question, if I can, I really care about this. We've got to think in a global sense about that. Now, I deliberately showed you the EV story. The electric vehicle story is really a global story. I would like to see, as I'm sure everyone in this room would, a big part of the supply chain and the jobs in the electric vehicles transition come to the UK, but it's not all going to be here. One of the reasons why we haven't advocated an even faster transition to electric transport is because we don't think the global supply chain is there yet to deliver it. So, you know, Norway's done that. It's done that with some incredibly rich tax subsidies to pull it off. But basically what Norway's doing, and I make no criticism of them, of Norway for this, but they're essentially creaming off the world's supply of the best electric vehicles. We need a global supply chain of it, otherwise it's not really a climate solution. So again, I think this is a similar answer, that we should be able to plan around that. There are critical minerals involved which come from places in the world that don't supply fossil fuels, and therefore this could be a growth industry for them. But equally, those parts of the world that are supplying some of those minerals and services don't just want to be a kind of machine producing a mineral. They want to also have value in that supply chain, and I think that's fine too. So I'm really up for that. It's slightly beyond my statutory remit to get into that, but what I wanted to say to you today is that we constrain a lot of the transitions that you see there by some of those factors. We want to be confident that you've got not just a sustainable supply chain in every sense for those minerals, but also that it's an ethical supply chain, that you're able to produce the stuff in the right way without things like child labour. And that requires a more global outlook on it. And I think the more that we talk in a global sense about these things, the better. And even on the emissions side, it's not just a story of what the UK itself produces. That's what those targets are about. There's a bigger story about what we are responsible for and what we consume. And again, we try and track that too, and hold back and constrain the analysis to affect the fact that there's a bigger story playing out here about all the things that we in the UK are reliant on and our relationship with other parts of the world with it. Again, exciting thing around all of that is that we can plan around that. That's the beauty of trying to do something by a certain date. You know, the more that we plan it, the better.
Thank you. Okay, to give Chris a little bit of a break here, I'm going to ask some questions to our other panelists, and then I'll open again to the floor. So first, I would really love to hear from Nisha on a very interesting question that we got from someone who submitted online. So they said, a just transition is a serious, essential, and difficult task, but it's also exciting, joyful, and beautiful. How can we bring joy, play, curiosity, and beauty into the conversation?
Okay, thank you. And I'm really pleased to hear this kind of question, because it's very often left out of many debates. You know, we're focusing on all this climate science and what's going to happen to us, and then maybe we've got a plan and hopefully that's going to work. But actually, there's so much going on out there that is really exciting. And it's quite interesting, these things that are linked into how we might engage with people as well. So, you know, if you flip certain narratives on their heads, you can actually see the wealth of climate action that's happening. And one of the things that I will often talk about is, do we actually need behavior change or do we need recognition? And actually there's a balance to be had. So, you know, sometimes I'll end up saying, you know, if you're asking the question, we need to engage with communities, then I say, I'll tell people, I think you're thinking about this the wrong way. How do you know that people aren't engaged? What makes you say that? Is it just that they're not doing the actions that you want? Or is it that you don't understand the ways in which people are acting? So the first thing is to kind of find that out and find out how you can connect with people. And when you do that, you'll see the most amazing things. So Black Seeds Network exists because we want to shine a light on the amazing Black environmentalists and environmentalists of colour in Bristol and beyond that are doing this incredible work. And I have to say that the three most inspiring events that I've seen recently, one, shout out to Bristol Green Capital Partnership. We partnered to help them organise their Nature the Healer event. And they brought lots of Black and brown leaders into a space, and basically those leaders then led that event, and it was so vibrant. There was drumming, there was just excitement that came out of that, joy. It was lots of people came away and said that was amazing, and they felt really warm. The next event that I saw was an event showcasing a film called Plant Power, which is a film that's been made about the incredible Judith Davis and also Amrish Pandya, and they're doing the most amazing work in St. Paul's, doing gangster gardening, engaging with people in their local community, speaking language that makes sense to people, getting people in to come and help them do their gardening and do that work. That event, again, was joyful, vibrant. There was food, there was energy. We came out smiling, and we had a great time. And then the third one is an event organised by Ian Solomon Kowal and his business partner Moya. And that event was called Come We Grow. It was held in a Black-owned space, and it showcased a variety of Black and brown environmentalists in Bristol. And again, just the energy, everybody came away was just really, really energized and joyful. And some people were messaging me sort of saying, I think we're going to do this, you know. So we can do these really fun, exciting things. All of those events were inclusive. It wasn't just for one group or another. And they were led at the grassroots, but connected in. Most of them were connected into some, they had presence from higher level decision makers and also from kind of so-called mainstream environmental institutions as well. So I could also talk about our assets and what we have.
No, you told me to rein you in.
Okay, just let me give you the broad headlines. So within our cultures, we have so much richness to explore. for my dissertation, I studied how the Black Seeds Network could strengthen the contributions of Black environmentalists and environmentalists of colour in Bristol. And what I found was the fact that you could tell stories about the things that people are doing and not have time to tell them all. So there's so much to explore there. There are cultural things that people do, there are celebrations, there's so much joy to be had. I would also say that it does also need to be handled with sensitivity. There are also lots of things that the communities that have been marginalised are facing, and they're really awful things often. It might be a lack of resources, a lack of access to things, but also, for example, in St. Paul's, there have been 3 murders within as many months. So the community is reeling from that and dealing with that. It's not the time to go and start talking about joy necessarily.
Yes.
So we have to know communities well, and we have to be able to work with them effectively.
Thank you so much. What a brilliant answer with lots of examples. Perfect. Ed, I'd like to ask you a question. Somebody is looking for good examples, successful examples of transitions, and especially in communities that are based around a kind of rapid transition. So, for example, communities based around fossil fuels. I know that you're an expert in the energy sector, so are there any examples of successful transitions that you ever draw on in your work?
There's probably more examples of bad, traumatic transitions, and as kind of Chris has highlighted, the memory of coal weighs heavy for many communities, and it's worth noting that this kind of language of just transition is sometimes seen with suspicion because of that memory of trauma. Exactly. And it's not necessarily for justice that communities look at with suspicion, it's for transition. The United Mine Workers Union in the US famously said, every time we hear the word transition, we know we're in trouble. Right. So there needs to be a proactive approach, and the examples of kind of positive transitions or positively managed transitions often involve a proactive approach which looks to context. It looks to, say, employees in the coal industry, and they can see those who have been quite sustained in their career and are maybe approaching retirement in 10, 15 years' time, and they approach that differently. They see what is a phase down to retirement which is positive, which is healthy, which supports these kind of workers. There'll be younger employees, and there'll be the need to reskill and to give new opportunities. And one way of doing that is ensuring that people can train on the job, or they have financial support whilst they are training. An example often comes from the Ruhr Valley in Germany, a famous coal region, much like the Welsh valleys over the bridge. And there was a sustained proactive approach, not just to close down the mines or the industry that was polluting, but to set up new industries and to support the workers move from one to the other. But that involved a proactive approach, and also this recognition that people have different contexts, different situations, and need to be handled and supported differently in that process.
Thank you, that's really helpful advice. And I'm glad you didn't end with there are no good examples.
It would have been the short answer.
Yes. Jaya, I want to ask you a question before I open back up to the floor. And I know that this is something you work on every day, but what would be your advice? What is one thing that a business could do to support just transition?
See, just one thing? One thing? All right, so I'm going to go with corporate transparency. Because corporate transparency is something that every ethical business needs to have as a foundation, because from that comes sustainability, from that comes accountability. If you cannot be transparent about the actions that you are taking, the people that you're doing it with, the partners who you're buying things from, then how on earth will anyone hold you to account? Now, by corporate transparency, I do not mean PR. It's got to come with some way of proving that you did what you did. Otherwise, it's just a PR exercise. So with transparency, you can then start to talk about, am I paying my people fairly? Am I paying my suppliers promptly? Because if you think about deeper and deeper into supply chains, the later you pay your supplier, the later they pay the others. And the trickle down of injustice just manages to completely escalate. So we can make a difference, businesses can make a difference just by being honest about where they're at, and then being held accountable about what they do next. And then you can look at your assets and your buildings and the land that you own and what you do with all of that.
Okay, so I will open back up to the floor now, and we can take a couple of questions at once. So let's go a little bit further back in the room. I see somebody raising their hand just here in the middle. Perfect, thank you. And if you could try, I know it's awkward, but like almost to eat the microphone, that would be very helpful.
Okay, I shall try. Social mobility is in decline in this country. How can we harness the opportunity of a just transition to net zero to improve the life chances of our young people, especially young people living in the poorest of circumstances?
Thank you, that was very clear. Excellent technique of using the microphone. I saw a hand on this side as well. Please, let's take another question. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for everything so far. So the current government choosing to defer and distract makes me quite cross. I watched Chris Packham's documentary recently about whether it's time to break the law in support of this transition. How would you suggest the average moderately informed person channel their rage?
Oh, very good question. So if you didn't hear that, he said, how can the average person channel their rage? Should we start with that question, and then we'll move on to the question of social mobility? Chris, you've had a break. Would you like to talk about rage?
Yeah, I experience rage.
Good. It's healthy.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it is healthy actually, but I think it's good to have a fire in your belly. I think, but I also think we've got to be practical about what's ahead. I mean, I think this point I keep returning to, and we've talked about it across the panel really, is that there are a range of views in this country, and we need to accommodate them all. And Prime Minister is channeling some of that, I think, post-Uxbridge, and thinks he's got a kind of way forward on it. We'll see if he's right electorally. But he does have a point that this is hard, and you need to kind of stay the course with it. And for me, that's where I try and channel my rage, is that there's it's not very productive to be angry. I think we should be looking hard at what works. So if that strategy doesn't work, let's move on to the next one. And policy is a bit like that, really. And I think my answer to your question on rage is use that as a creative force. Because if this strategy that we've been on for a while doesn't work, then there's another one. And there's an inevitability to it. There's a point I should have made really when I talked to you earlier. The beauty of it is there is an inevitability to us doing all these things. We'll have to get there eventually. We might as well get there early because it's a bit of a race. And we can. That's. I find that very stimulating. So you can be disappointed. I think that's all right, but don't be angry. And then let's get into the next strategy. And some of the things the Prime Minister did in his speech. There's a sort of ideology behind some of the things that he changed that is worth challenging. It comes from us, actually. So he moved the dates of things. So, that whole story of the investment chart that I showed you is based on this idea that we invest in new things and replace old things at the point when they go kaput. If you buy a gas boiler today, it'll last 15 years. So if you need to hit zero emissions by 2050, you need to stop putting them in by 2035. That's just maths. But that doesn't need to be the only way you do this. I have to say, I think the Prime Minister's outlook on this is probably, well, why don't we try a different thing and sort of give the incentives for people to do stuff without putting the hard dates in place. That's perfectly legitimate. So, let's use that as the next inspiration for the next bit of creative policies on that particular thing. And I think a lot of what he did in the speech was a bit like that, actually. He wasn't challenging the overall goal, which is good. He was challenging the means to achieve it, and that's okay. So let's just kind of keep moving on. So sort of stay mildly angry, maybe that's the way to have it.
I'm trying to look into the panelists' eyes and see who looks most angry. Yes. Would anyone like to come forward? But I would like to hear from each of you.
So anger is partly my thing, but it's, I suppose you call it passion, and you'd call it sort of righteous outrage, and there's a deliciousness in there that you can tap into. And I found whenever I'm feeling helpless, more than anger actually, you go through sort of anger because you're feeling helpless that you can't do anything, and you do have to find ways in which you can make a difference, so you focus on what you can affect. And for me, if I feel really bad about something, then there's obviously a petition you can sign, there's a letter you can write, but you can use your other hats, so you can talk to your kids about the way that they can tackle these things. You can engage with your schools and see whether or not you can help. You wear many different hats and you have influence in different community settings and work settings. Ask your place of work, your employer, what they're doing. Hold them to account because they need you more than you need them in some respects. Obviously you still need your wage, but you can challenge and you can put that in. So I would find your levers of influence and channel, and stay angry. just quietly.
Quietly angry.
Simmer.
So you're saying you can seethe and cope.
Yeah.
That's a Gen Z joke for those of you who don't know that.
It's empowering. Use it to empower.
Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, I spend quite a lot of time being very frustrated, which then leads to anger. And I think it has to be kind of managed. So on one level, anger passion is kind of this combination of kind of love and anger together, and it may be love for other people, for the planet, for nature, all those things that drive you to take action. And so that's kind of one element of it. But then I also think you do have to look after yourself. You can't be that angry all the time. And if you are, you'll burn out. So I think you need to find ways to channel it that's a bit more healthy, be able to calm down, and get the people around you that, that are your people that could support you and help you do more. And I think as well in terms of, so I spend a lot of time being very frustrated when talking about equity and equalities in environmental spaces, often because some people just haven't even they don't even know what I'm talking about. So that if that's the starting point, and where we're trying to get to is so far along, obviously that involves a lot of very difficult and very frustrating conversations, and that isn't healthy to be doing in the long term. So I think finding ways to relax, find that joy, find the people that can support you in that. But
find
also,
beauty.
Well, I don't know if I could find beauty. I mean, there's beauty in the struggle and all that, but we're going down a different road there. Again, that reference might not land in this room. So, but I think
Thank you.
Action and support and rest.
Great. Ed, is there anything else you wanted to say about anger?
If you're angry because you want to have a more coherent, ambitious climate action, we have a power of stories, which is what we've discussed a lot. And the stories we have for climate action are warmer homes, cleaner air, better jobs, new skills. There can be stories around creating new futures for the next generations. When you compare those to stories which are holding back climate action, we can see the difference. So if you're angry, take it, but tell stories and make people hear them.
That's good advice. I'm going to take chair's privilege and just say, I can't remember the quote, but I've seen some really nice advice around anger, which is that when anger comes knocking and you open the door, you'll find that it's grief.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Which really chimes with me. So anger is legitimate. It is something that you should pay attention to, but often it really is about grief. And when we think about climate change, loss and damage, just transition, there is a lot of grief. There's things we're losing, things are changing, and it is a struggle. So
our young people
do pay
are
attention.
really suffering. In the schools, there's a massive mental health crisis, and a lot of that is to do with climate grief. And what are we inheriting? What have we got left? We have to
acknowledge
respond
that,
to that.
exactly. Yes. So the first question, but we're answering second, was about social mobility and how just transition could improve social mobility in our society if we do it right. So I wanted to turn to Jaya first, if that's okay, to see whether you have any response to that question.
Probably take off the business hat and start thinking as a parent and someone who's involved with the school and our young people and social mobility from their perspective, and saying that it is about helping them understand that there's something to aspire to. So there's a lot of hopelessness, and we have to counter that with the hope of engaging with this new future that will be for them, because everything we are doing right now is for them. So I think we need to get more involved and show them that this is possible, show them the role models that they need to see, rather than the hopelessness that they're hearing from the rest of what's going on now.
Great, thank you. And Ed, I know you think through these kinds of issues in your book, especially about fairness and social mobility and increasing people's life chances in their everyday lives, really. So is there anything you would like to add on that question for social mobility?
A ambitious green skills, not even a green skills agenda which foresees what we need and seeks to address it in a way which is as inclusive as possible in higher education and in further education and in adult education as well, and every form of education possible from beginning to the end of that process can give new opportunities and livelihoods and security for so many people if done right. And again, we need to ensure that that is designed with that in mind. It's not just a skills gap kind of problem, it's a solving a skills gap and a helping people along the way.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question.
Could I comment on that?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, please, you can comment.
So I'd say that we also need to address the current inequalities that are in our institutions and in our systems. So if we want people to get better social mobility, then we have to look at where we are right now and what needs to change within that. Academia, for example, is not as inclusive as it could be, so that's going to be affecting the kind of degrees that people get and the kind of jobs that they may go on to get. We know with the green skills or the new jobs that might be coming, we know that the environmental sector at the moment is the second least diverse after agriculture. And we know that there are programs which are fantastic, and they're getting people from different communities and different backgrounds into those spaces, but then what happens to them when they're there? Are they supported in those spaces, or are those institutions where they're being recruited into, are they not diverse for a reason? Is something happening in those institutions that needs to change? So there is an awful lot of work that we can be doing currently to break down those barriers and change the system as it is right now.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'd like to take one more question from the audience, and then I have a final question for our panelists as well. Let's see. It's so hard to see. There is a hand right in the middle there.
Yeah.
Let's go to that person. Thank you.
Favoured that side.
Have I?
Yeah, it's definitely.
It's because I'm sitting on this side, so you can't be perfect. I'm sorry.
Hey, I hear a lot of conversation in the media within politics about the transitions in the energy system towards renewables and in our transportation system towards electric vehicles and stuff, but I hear very little conversation about transitions in our food system. It's very clear signs that if we transition to a plant-based food system, this would free up thousands of acres of land which we could rewild to restore our biodiversity. And I think it's our government's responsibility to support farmers in this transition and to commit to rewilding the freed up land.
Thank you. It's turning into a comment rather than a question, so I'm going to stop you there.
What are your views on the role of this transition in the fight against climate change and biodiversity?
Thank you very much. Would anyone like to volunteer to answer that question?
I mean, I'm very happy to take it. I mean, you'd be very glad to hear we're not going to have a meat tax in this country. So that's the Prime Minister has promised that.
Chickened out.
It's remarkable. Chickened out, very good. Nor will we have 7 bins. So there's all sorts of issues going on here. But I just wanted to basically agree with the premise of that question. I mean, one of the fundamentals in all of the work I've just shown you here is that it's not all about the energy system. The energy system is indeed the biggest driver here because fossil fuels are the biggest problem, but we do the sort of net bit in net zero is what else you're doing with land and seas, but particularly land. And the UK is quite an interesting place to look at that challenge of land because it's so land constrained. So we are not the US. We don't have sort of prairies with nothing on them. Most of the land in this country is agricultural. A large proportion of that land is basically grazing. So you've got sheep and cows roaming across it and not therefore being used for other purposes. One of the challenges here is that land in some shape or form really is needed for the achievement of net zero, so we're going to have to free it up. And that's just one aspect of the transition that we need to see. I think we should be thinking in the food system terms about all of this. And I think the other thing to bring into the food system is the challenge of climate change itself on that food system. We are hugely reliant on imported food in this country. And it would be lovely to say we could fix all that tomorrow, but we're right up against a set of behaviours in the economy that are. Another term I don't like is behaviour change, because it implies poor behaviour. People do stuff because it's easy or because that's all they know, and you can't blame them for that. So I think if you want to change some of this, and I think it's sensible to do so for climate reasons, but a host of other reasons, including health as well, never mind landscape beauty and all the other things that come with rewilding, we need to think in more practical terms about what the real incentive would be for people to want to change some of those patterns of consumption. And it's no good at all people like me saying that people are just doing the wrong stuff. And I pick that up a lot. Yeah. People aren't bad. They're just doing things because that's what they know. So I would like to see more of a discussion, not so much about meat taxes, but about what positive incentives there are to change some of that. And that for me is the secret to this. It's not about nudging. It's just about generally having a more positive discussion about that, and not being so kind of dogmatic about some of these things. I think we are going to have a really good look at those food system issues when it comes to the next round of big analysis that we do for the next carbon budget and the next climate change risk assessment. We do those every 5 years. Food systems right in the heart of it.
Thank you very much. Okay, so final question, and this person was very specific about their timeline. And they ask, what are your greatest hopes and fears in the next 25 years? If you would like to pick a different timeline, that's fine, but they were specific. And I would like to challenge you to answer this question in about 1 minute each, if you can manage. So greatest hopes, greatest fears, roughly in the next 25 years.
Me.
I'm looking right at you, Ed.
Right. When I saw this question, I was like, whoa, and then I realized that actually 25 years in the grand scheme of things is not a long time, kind of geologically, but in my lifetime, it's a huge chunk of it. In 25 years, I will be 58, I will still be working here if they have me, and I am actually full of hope for that 25 years, because I think we have the stories, we have the knowledge, we have momentum. And that hope is driven by a belief that more of us know about the problem, more of us know about solutions, and we have a greater understanding of how those solutions can help people in different ways as well. So I feel that I find hope in stories and narratives. In terms of fears, I'm very worried about walking down these steps in a few minutes' time.
I'll hold your hand. Yeah. We'll get through it. Nisha.
Like you, I love stories, and I think that they're immensely powerful. And so I'll come back to that in a minute. My greatest fear is that we're not going to be able to work together well, that this golden opportunity for us to both tackle climate issues and address inequalities will sort of slip by, and will entrench inequalities further, and will experience environmental degradation. However, my greatest hope is that through storytelling, through connection, through addressing these power imbalances and all kinds of barriers, that we can actually get to something really quite amazing and really quite special. And that's the kind of world that I really want to live in. So that's my hope, that we make it there. And we'll do that through connecting with one another and learning about each other's stories and finding out what's already going on and telling those stories with inspiration and hope.
Thank you. Jaya.
Right, so I was going to go glib with the whole kind of, perhaps we'd have psychedelics in the water so that everyone would love each other and want to do the right thing.
Didn't expect that.
Well, look, this is plan B, and if anything else happens, that's probably the one I'd go with. But I want to come back to that point that you made.
I love Bristol.
So do
Don't get that answer in class.
I'll come back to your point on land, actually, because so with my own geek hat on, different one to yours, Chris, I did, my social enterprise took land registry data and analysed it across and cross-referenced it with Friends of the Earth data on land that we'd like to be able to afforest, reforest, help rebuild our environment. So, long story short, we found out that 130% of the land that was required at that point when we did that study, which was a couple of years ago, so it was a 25-year plan, so the 25 thing is probably very relevant. So the corporates own 130% of that land. That's more land that was required at the time that target was set. And the good news is that that's only 5% of the total land owned by corporates. So even if corporates did just a little bit, even if they used 25% of their land, it would still move the needle in the right direction. So my hope is that corporates will get their acts together, start realizing that they too are vehicles for activism, get their people involved and start to knit together this long tail of land that can start to rebuild what we've got. And then we can scale and go to the whole world. How's that?
Very
beautiful.
Thank you.
So I didn't prep an answer to any of these questions, so I'm going to give you a very off the cuff answer and try and tie these two things together. My biggest fear, after doing this job for 6 years and working in this space for now well over a decade, is that we get gripped by how hard it is and how impossible it is to achieve these things that I've talked to you about tonight. And of course they're hard, but I see that more and more, this sort of hard, oh, it's impossible because it's such a big thing. And therefore my biggest hope is that we accept that it's a big thing and do it because of that. I mean, I think that's what we used to do. Look where we're sitting. So, we don't make halls like this anymore. And there is something, I'd be careful how I choose my words here, but I kind of feel we should be a bit more Victorian about it, actually, that we should do things because they are hard to do, as a JFK quote. The thing is, it's not that difficult, so we can do this stuff and really see the benefits of it pretty quickly, but we should also take a bit of joy at the fact that we're trying. And I think that, for me, is something you don't hear enough about, particularly from our political leaders, is that it's worth doing this. It is hard, it's a thing that we should try. Let's have a go at this because everyone else is going to have to do the same thing. And I would love to see us have that more sort of spirited discussion about the value of all this for all sorts of reasons beyond climate, because it's exciting. It's an exciting thing to try, so we should have a go.
What a wonderful note to end on. So please join me in thanking our panel and praying for Ed as he walks down the steps.
This is where I check if my microphone is still working. It was certainly working when I was coughing and interrupting the speakers, so apologies for that. I think you'll all agree, I mean, that was a superb discussion and a brilliant presentation. I think it was thought-provoking, it was very human, which I think is always important. And I think it is actually, what comes out of it is actually a very positive story. So I'm not going to even attempt to try and summarize anything that we've just heard. But I suppose what I will do is just say some of the key takeaways that I took out of that. I think first is a real note of positivity. We can do this. It is feasible. It is possible. We know the solutions. It's around the will to do it. And I think that last round of discussions and answers really, I think, pulled that out. And we shouldn't be afraid of doing things just because they're hard. But we also need to recognize that not all political leaders necessarily give you the message that it's very hard. I think it'd be true to say other political leaders maybe had, and then within the next year, you will all have an opportunity to choose those. But I think about where I live, which is not here, it's in Scotland. Scotland has done a lot of work and has had a very strong political discourse, for instance, around consensus, around net zero, around adaptation. So it is possible, it is doable, and I think that positive note is very good. I like the concept around joy, that we shouldn't necessarily see this as being a hair shirt moment. It's not all doom, it's not all gloom. As well as all this hard work, it actually can be fun. We can find fun in doing that, and we should do that. And I think both Nisha and Ed and Jaya, you all talked about stories. You also talked about we need to have those stories. If we're angry, get the positive story out. Because simply just protesting and saying everything's terrible without offering solutions doesn't bring the rest of the world with you. So the people, as Chris said, not everybody does believe climate change is a big deal in the same way as perhaps we do in this hall. So we have to find ways, and stories are really important. Transparency, Jaya, you talked about. And again, as an ex-civil servant, music to my ears. Transparency is unaccountability as a consequence of that. Not just about corporates, not just about governments, but about us as individuals, as communities, to one another, about being accountable to each other, being transparent about what we do and what we believe, is actually really important, because it's only by doing that, I think, that you can really promote change. And two last thoughts from me from listening to this. I think fairness really shone through. But I think when we're thinking about just transition and inequalities and inequity, we also have to remember, I think as Nisha, you put it, there are embedded structural inequalities that exist within society. So people might be given access to things but may not take them up. That's not, as Chris said, because they're bad people or they don't know the right behaviors. Sometimes that's about structural societal inequalities, and we need to have an honest conversation about that. We need to recognize that climate change isn't something divorced from the rest of society. It's not something divorced from the rest of the economy. It's integral, and we need to be thinking in that way. And my final point, and I suppose this is me taking off my Cabot director hat and putting my hat on that looks at primarily research around issues in lower middle income countries. I love the question about, if you're talking about just transition, it's not just about doing things justly here in the UK. It's how do we occupy a place in the world? And bearing in mind we're a country that has, it could be argued, a somewhat troubling history about our role in the world, and this city specifically has a potentially rather troubling history about how it has engaged with the world. It's absolutely clear to me that what we can't do as we transition to a net zero economy, as we support our own adaptations, that should come at the cost of people in poorer countries and in poorer societies. We have to be honest and say just transition means a transition across the globe. It means working with everybody. It means bringing people up to similar levels of what they want to achieve in their socio-economic development. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we will remain with global problems. There's a lot of discourse around migration, for instance, in the press, and a lot of outcry about it. There's very little about what people talk about. Well, why is it that people want to move? And people want to move because where they are is distinctly less nice than where they could be going. And so unless we're going to invest about trying to look at equality more globally, we will still be left with the same set of problems. And specifically around some of the things that we might look around in terms of rare earth metals, we need to remember resources can be a curse, particularly for poor countries. So oil has driven more corruption in more poor countries than virtually any other factor that we've had in the modern life. And so we need to recognize that. So a just transition needs to be just transition that looks beyond our city, beyond our country, and really is international. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now and just say thank you again to Chris, to the panel for a brilliant discussion, to Alix for chairing that and getting that so engaged. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight, to listening and participating in this discussion. Thank you very much and have a great evening.